Hello everyone. In an attempt to keep things civil, I have 7 simple rules for myself. Welcome to the Angle of Reason. I've only seen a few of Kyle's videos. We seem to have some ideological differences, which obviously leads to some disagreements. But as I feel some points he makes here are so egregiously wrong, I feel compelled to discuss. Here he talks about Bernie Sanders' plan to change work laws. He starts off by reading Huffington Post's rundown on it.
Bernie Sanders has a detailed plan to help working people that he just released. HuffPost says Bernie Sanders has a plan to revive labor unions. The senator tells HuffPost it's time to ban right-to-work laws and make it easier to unionize.
For those unfamiliar with right-to-work laws are statutes in 28 U.S. states that prohibit union security agreements between companies and workers' unions. Under these laws, employees in unionized workplaces are banned from negotiating contracts which require all members who benefit from the union contract to contribute to the costs of union representation. According to the Legal Defense Foundation, right-to-work laws prohibit union security agreements or agreements between employers and labor unions that govern the extent to which an established union can require employees' membership, payment of union dues, or fees as a condition of employment either before or after hiring. Right-to-work laws do not aim to provide general guarantee of employment to people seeking work, but rather are a government ban on the contractual agreements between employers and union employees, requiring workers to pay for the costs of union representation. The federal government operates under open shop rules nationwide, but many of its employees are represented by unions. Unions that represent professional athletes have written contracts that include particular representation provisions, such as the National Football League, but the application is limited to whenever and wherever is legal, as the Supreme Court has clearly held that the application of a right-to-work law is determined by the employee's predominant job status. Players on professional sports teams in states with right-to-work laws are thus subject to those laws and cannot be required to pay any portion of union dues as a condition of continued employment. 22 states, as well as the District of Columbia, do not have right-to-work laws. Missouri's is on hold after a petition called for a statewide vote on the issue. In January 2012, in the immediate aftermath of the passage of Indiana's right-to-work law, Rasmussen polls found that 74% of likely U.S. voters supported right-to-work laws, but most also don't think a non-union worker should enjoy benefits negotiated by the union. In Michigan, in January through March 2013, a poll found that 43% of those polled thought the law would help Michigan's economy, while 41% thought it would hurt. And for those interested, here are the 28 states that have right-to-work laws in one form or fashion. Thank you, Scott5114 and Wikipedia for the use of this image. Studies of the economic effect, according to Tim Bartik of the W.E. Upjohn Institute of Employment Research, studies of the effect of right-to-work laws abound but are not consistent. Studies have found both some positive effect on job growth and no effect. Thomas Holmes argues that it's difficult to analyze right-to-work laws by comparing states due to other similarities between states that have passed these laws. For instance, right-to-work states have some strong pro-business policies, making it difficult to isolate the effect of right-to-work laws. Looking at the growth of states in the Southeast following World War II, Bartik notes that while they have right-to-work laws, they also have benefited from factors like widespread use of air conditioning and different modes of transportation that help decentralize manufacturing. Economist Thomas Holmes compared counties close to the border between states with right-to-work laws, thereby holding constant an array of factors related to geography and climate. He found that the cumulative growth of employment and manufacturing in the right-to-work states was 26 percentage points greater than that in non-right-to-work states. However, given the study design, Holmes points out, my results do not say that it is right-to-work laws that matter, but rather the pro-business package offered by right-to-work states seems to matter. Moreover, as noted by Kevin Drum and others, this result may reflect business relocation rather than an overall enhancement of economic growth, since businesses prefer locating in states where costs are low and rules are lax. There are several arguments for and against labor unions, for example, minority rights and due process, unfairness, freedom of association, political contributions, cost of living, free riders, freedom of contract and association, corporate interests, so on and so forth. We'll get to some of those a little bit later. The basic takeaway from this is that you can't exactly trust all the studies you see with regard to right-to-work laws because of all the other factors involved. Generally, the right-to-work states have several other laws that entice business to locate there, which increases the demand for labor. Economics 101 tells us when demand goes up without altering the supply, you can demand more compensation, in this case being more time off, better working hours, conditions, and of course compensation. The methods of the two strategies are different, but both lead to similar results, unions being a proactive system and market forces being a reactive system. More on unions later.
Sanders' bill, called the Workplace Democracy Act, would remove several of the major barriers to organized labor's growth. It would ban right-to-work laws, which allow employees to opt out of paying union dues, even though the union must still bargain on their behalf, leading to what unions call free riding. In recent years, Republicans and business groups have pushed to expand the reach of right-to-work laws, which are now on the books in 28 states, including traditional labor strongholds like Michigan and Wisconsin. The bill would also guarantee workers the right to form a union after a majority in their workplace have signed cards saying that that is their wish. Card check, as the process is known, lets organizers bypass the holding of a secret ballot election before which employers often pressure workers to vote no. Among its other provisions, Sanders' current bill would make it easier for unions to seek mediation when they can't reach a first contract with an employer in a reasonable period of time. Negotiations over a first contract can be an effective stall tactic for businesses, sometimes dragging on for years. The bill would also legalize secondary boycotts, allowing unions to target an employer's clients as a way to pressure the employer. Secondary boycotts were outlawed in 1947 under the Taft-Hartley Act, the same law that paved the way for right-to-work statutes. With Republicans controlling both chambers of Congress and the White House, Sanders' legislation has no real chance of becoming law anytime soon, but it could be another indicator that high-profile Democrats plan to make rejuvenating the labor movement a priority, particularly as progressive activists have been pushing the agenda to the left since the 2016 elections. So this is called the Workplace Democracy Act. It includes Tammy Baldwin, Sherrod Brown, Elizabeth Warren, Kirsten Gillibrand. They've signed on to it. And listen, this is part of Bernie Sanders' mission to shift the Overton window back to the left.
The Overton window, for those who don't know, is also known as the window of discourse, is the range of ideas tolerated in public discourse. The term is derived from its originator, Joseph P. Overton, who in his description of his window claimed that an idea's political viability depends mainly on whether it falls within the window, rather than on politicians' individual preferences. According to Overton's description, his window includes a range of policies considered politically acceptable in the current climate of public opinion, which a politician can recommend without being considered too extreme to gain or keep public office. The Overton window is an approach to identifying which ideas define the domain of acceptability within a democracy's possible governmental policies. Proponents of policies outside the window seek to persuade or educate the public in order to move and or expand the window. Proponents of current policies or similar ones within the window seek to convince people that policies outside it should be deemed unacceptable. After Overton's death, others have examined the concept of adjusting the window by the deliberate promotion of ideas outside of it, or outer fringe ideas, with the intention of making less fringe ideas acceptable by comparison. This is the door-in-the-face technique of persuasion. Here's a graphical depiction of the Overton window. Thank you to Hydrogm, or however you pronounce that name, and Wiki for the use of your image. As you can see, the Overton window hovers over policies that are popular, sensible, and acceptable, and anything that's considered too radical or unthinkable is outside the window. Now, obviously, the unthinkable or unacceptable includes things like anti-Semitism, where even if a politician holds those views, they need to keep that shit to themselves if they want to get elected. Now consider what the acceptable things to talk about are. Where you think the Overton window is might depend on your particular ideology or understanding of the window. You can consider the window to be a sliding window hovering over left versus right agendas, or a fixed window with agenda items shifting into or out of it. I'm more of the minded as of the latter, where it's not shifting, but this is just splitting hairs on semantics.
See, what happened is, post the FDR era, and then in a little bit of the LBJ era too, but after that, definitely with the Reagan Revolution in the 1980s, what happened was they famously said the era of big government is over, and there was a massive shift of the Overton window to the right.
If you were astute enough to notice LBJ and FDR were Democrats, you might be asking why it would be that their administrations resulted in a shift of the Overton window to the right. Here's the sleight of hand he does by leaving out a major cause of that happening. LBJ was president during World War II. He died just before the end when his successor, Harry S. Truman, dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As the war droned on and we made our way through liberated Nazi-controlled land, we got a first-hand vision into the big socialist Nazi government atrocities of forced labor, living conditions, and of course the death camps of the Holocaust. Through the following administrations, we fought against other socialist regimes, both hot and cold, in Vietnam, Korea, and the USSR. And of course, don't forget, the Second Red Scare, McCarthyism, happened during this time period too. But carry on.
Where now, even the Democrats kind of bought into the Republican premises and framework. Namely, that shrinking government is a good thing, and, you know, the welfare state is a bad thing. They literally demonized the word welfare. Like, welfare state, ooh, bad.
I don't know what he refers to here about Democrats buying into Republican premises of small government. TPP, Dodd-Frank, massive regulatory executive branch. Republicans haven't been particularly small government since Reagan and arguably Big Bush. I only say that about Reagan because of his push for reforming taxes and government spending. I find his point here to be disingenuous. What he is right about is this is a big government-style bill, and Sanders is trying to shift it closer to the Overton window. By introducing it when it has no hope of passing, that is the aforementioned door-in-face technique. Also, just a quick note on welfare demonization. It is a social safety net with good intentions. From a behavioral point of view, you have two ways to correct bad behavior. Punish bad behavior or reward good behavior. The question comes to whether you help people down on their luck with a social safety net until they turn themselves around, but also reward bad behavior, or lose the government-run safety net to not incentivize bad behavior that can spread to later generations. I don't agree with demonizing welfare, but not incentivizing bad behavior through wealth redistribution is kind of important to me. The libertarian in me says local charities are better suited to handle both issues at play here.
And what happened was the New Deal Democrat era was over, and so you didn't have Democrats anymore who were openly fighting for workers' rights and unions and for the little guy.
Here again, I think he's being disingenuous with Democrat support of unions, although he is referring to FDR's New Deal in 1933 to 1936, but labor unions go way back in one form or another to the country's founding. The first organized labor union was the National Labor Union, formed in 1866 by activists trying to unionize government workers. They weren't supported wholly by any party. They actually started their own political party, the National Labor Party, as an alternative to the two predominant ones. Naturally, they were just as corrupt as any other powerful entity and even worked to exclude Chinese workers. Later incarnations included the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor. Lobbying, protests, and even violent riots, such as the Haymarket Riot, pushed labor unions into the radical column for most Americans. FDR's 1933 National Industrial Recovery Act pushed 8-hour workdays, minimum wages, collective bargaining. Parts of it was replaced by the Wagner Act, which ensured workers the right to form unions. The New Deal wasn't the precipice forcing businesses to change, as there were already inroads in many big businesses that could manage it. 8-hour workdays, for example, was used as a benefit for some corporations such as Ford as early as 1910, but was largely adopted by other businesses as late as 1950. Basically, the aforementioned groups were not directly politically aligned, but most likely leaned towards the Democratic Party, evidenced by the creation of the Colored National Labor Union and their documented support for the Republican Party. Definitely, by present day, labor unions almost entirely lean left. I suppose he's putting unions as a political left because of FDR's New Deal, and I find that accurate enough. However, Democrats fighting for unions, which is a subtle difference, and the little guy is up for debate. Given that Democrats started the KKK in 1865 and rejuvenated it in 1915, as well as passed and operated under Jim Crow laws well through the 1950s, if the Democratic Party pushing segregation, lynching, and unions take another look for what purpose unions and minimum wages are really intended.
So the Democrats got into bed with largely the same funders as Republicans. They got into bed with for-profit health insurance companies. They got into bed with Big Pharma. They got into bed with Wall Street and the military-industrial complex. And that's why you've had these watered-down, weak, corporate, centrist/center-right Democrats.
So here we go again with the get into bed with line. Whenever someone says the politicians are bought off by XYZ Corp or lobby, the first question should be which came first, the policy XYZ liked which spurred the donation, or the donation that spurred the policy. My own rules require me not to impugn negative intentions. I say the former policy spurred donation unless I have proof otherwise. To say that someone voting for deregulating Wall Street and they got money from Wall Street, for example, means they were bought off is, in my judgment, dishonest without some data points to tie them to those negative intentions. That is, of course, assuming that the deregulations themselves are a negative in some fashion.
Largely because of their funders and because of the dominant philosophy that came from the 1980s and onward. Well, the results are in. The middle class is obliterated.
The middle class hasn't been obliterated. This is a flat-out lie. The middle class has gotten smaller like the lower class, but the upper class has gotten larger. There are also surveys and studies indicating that the lower and middle classes shrank by moving up. Even the Washington Post claimed way back in 2016 that the upper end had exploded in size as the lower end had dwindled. Is the Middle Class Moving Up by Robert J. Samuelson. Notice the date, June 26, 2016. It turns out the middle class isn't stagnant after all, which, by the way, I could point out, even in 2016 we knew it wasn't obliterated, it was stagnant according to these people. You know the conventional wisdom, the richest 1% of Americans have siphoned off all the income gains of recent decades. Everyone else is treading water. The claim has been repeated so often that it's taken on aura of truth. The reality is different. Living standards for most income groups have improved, especially for the upper middle class, which has more than doubled in size. We know this from a new study by economist Stephen Rose of the Urban Institute, a think tank. Rose subdivided the population into 5 economic classes. The poor and near poor had annual incomes up to about $30,000. The lower middle class from $30,000 to $50,000, middle class from $50,000 to $100,000, the upper middle class from $100,000 to $350,000, and the rich $350,000 and up. He then examined how each group had fared between 1979 and 2014. Here's what he found. There was a gradual and broad-based shift of Americans from poorer to richer status. Productivity gains have translated into higher living standards more than is generally believed. The most spectacular change involved the explosion of the upper middle class incomes from $100,000 to $350,000. It grew from 12.9% of Americans in 1979 to 29.4% in 2014. From 1 in 8 U.S. households to more than 1 in 4. The rich, $350,000 in income or more, went from 0.1% of the households to 1.8% in 2014. If these two groups were combined, nearly 1/3 of Americans have incomes exceeding $100,000. Meanwhile, the poor segments of the population declined. The poor and near poor, less than $30,000 in income, dropped from 24.3% of the population in 1979 to 19.8% in 2014. The lower middle class, $30,000 to $50,000, fell from 23.9% to 17.1%, and the middle class, $50,000 to $100,000, decreased from 38.8% to 32%. All in all, it's an important story. The growth in the rich and upper middle class and the declining proportion of the population in the middle and lower classes indicate widespread economic growth between 1979 and 2014, writes Rose. Still, the story is largely ignored in favor of the notion that only the top 1% are advancing. The murkier truth is that the top 1% are simply getting richer much faster than everyone else. That's Rose's conclusion. Growth was not distributed equally, and it's buttressed from a paper from the economist John Komlos of the University of Munich. Komlos estimates that the income of the richest 1% have been growing about 3.9% annually, compared to 1% or less for most of the population. Here's where I apply my rules again and assume good intentions. Perhaps he hasn't seen the studies, or saw them but thought they were inaccurate. However, he needs this myth as an axiom for propping up another myth later on.
Now, during the time in U.S. history that was called the Golden Age of Economic Expansion, we had the middle class that was the envy of the world. We also had incredibly strong unions and high taxes on the rich and strong marketplace regulations.
Of course, you'd have to believe the previous myth to believe this could ever happen. The post-World War II economic expansion is what he's referring to, also known as the post-war economic boom, or the long boom, or the golden age of capitalism. It was a period of strong economic growth beginning after World War II and ending with the 1973-75 recession. The United States, Soviet Union, Western Europe, and East Asia countries in particular experienced unusually high and sustained growth together with full employment. Contrary to early predictions, this high growth also included many countries that had been devastated by the war, such as Japan, West Germany, Austria, France, Italy, Greece, Taiwan, and South Korea. Causes listed in this Wikipedia article include increased productivity from automation created during the war due to labor shortages in some sectors, as well as distribution advances by roads, warehouses, and material handling. New products emerged after the war, such as commercial planes, television, and my favorite, computers. Various economic schools of thought have their explanations. Taxes were high through the war, but the economy didn't boom until several years after the war. Taxes were higher on the low end, too. Domestic spending wasn't the only spending the U.S. did. The U.S. also helped to rebuild the war-torn countries. War makes for good economies and national pride. The basic takeaway from this is that to say the Golden Age was all to do with unions and high taxes on the rich ignores all other factors. Also take note of strong marketplace regulations. For this I go to George Washington University, Columbia College of Arts and Sciences. Although this is transposing strong for number, strong is hard to quantify. Take note of the two stats for pages in registries. The one going back to 1936 is every proposed regulation as well as executive orders and such. The other graph that starts in 1950, despite what the article title says, is just federal regulations. Notice the sharp uptick in federal regulations since the end of the Golden Age, 73. If the regulations helped fuel the economy, we should go back to those levels, not up higher. Do note again the difference between number of pages and the relative strictness of those regulations cannot be correlated. The argument from the political right is about reducing their numbers to leave only meaningful ones.
So now Bernie Sanders is trying to make it so that that's what the Democrats stand for again. They stand for tight regulations on Wall Street and the marketplace. They stand for higher taxes on the rich. They stand for fighting for unions. So he's right. And this stuff guaranteed. Listen, man, it's not a coincidence that when we had our strongest labor unions, we had the best middle class and the middle class that was the envy of the world.
Coincidence? I would argue, yes, it is a coincidence. Or perhaps in spite of those, we had our golden age. More on unions shortly.
So you want to stop the stagnating wages? You want to bring back a healthy middle class? You have to revitalize unions.
I've just shown that wages haven't stagnated. In fact, they've gone up enough to move people into upper classes. It sounds like the decline of unions either had little to no effect on upward movement of people or had a positive effect.
So all of these ideas are right on point for what needs to be done. And then, of course, Bernie's also pushing $15 minimum wage. He's pushing Medicare for all. He's pushing free college and all of these things. If you put all these things together, man, listen, we can actually make the United States great. And the wars on top of that, do a New Deal. We can make the United States a thriving social democracy. And he's leading that fight. And it's great that he's doing this, but we need aggressive, consistent Democrats who are all going to push for this, because one guy can't do it on his own. But thankfully, activists have been pushing the Democratic Party left, and they shouldn't stop.
So there you have it. Just remember that Germany in 1930s was a democracy that voted in a socialist that hated the rich. Jews, top 1%. They also very heavily regulated corporations to the point of almost nationalizing them. None of that ended well. I'm not equating anyone to that regime, just pointing out the similarities. I have linked among my sources a report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Union memberships have declined since 1987 dramatically. However, it hasn't changed much in more recent years, currently hovering around the 11% mark overall. As percentages go, when the number of jobs increase but the labor union participation rate stays the same, that means the union participation numbers went up comparatively. Also to note, in the BLS report, in 2017, the average union worker made a little over $1,000 per week, or about $54,000 per year, which is higher than the non-union workers by about $200 per week, or about $10,000 per year less. However, the median household income in the U.S. in 2016, the prior year, was $57,000. So when you might have a higher salary in a union where unions exist, you're still better off without unions altogether. There are also several pros and cons for unions that aren't talked about commonly together. Unions can collectively negotiate higher wages, benefits, and conditions, but that can get out of hand, driving the cost so high the business has to raise prices, cut workers, or more heavily load workers to increase output. The union dues and fees can offset or overtake the union negotiated wages compared to non-union equivalents. Unions and union employees aren't perfect angels in and of themselves. Restricting disciplinary actions can artificially increase job security. Unions can easily be corrupted with regards to cronyism, as in who's allowed into inner circles, who gets promotions and such. All of this can lead to stagnating skills. There is a balance of power between employer and employee and employer and union. Unions can wield great power over employers through worker strikes. However, the often combative nature of such power struggles can cause the very working conditions unions are created to combat. Compare power struggles using threats of worker strikes versus employers choosing employment perks to entice people to leave their current employment and join them. There are some industries where skills of employees are easily transitioned from one business to another. Sales, marketing, medical professionals, pretty much anything in the STEM fields, especially in big cities and suburban areas surrounding them. When wages stagnate, management gets screwy, co-workers piss you off too much, there is perceptually greener pastures in other businesses. That is especially true when the job market outgrows the labor pool. That said, there is a very strong case for unions in very pigeonholed industries or natural monopolies. Think about coal miners, for example, likely a single coal mining company for 100 miles. Coal miners might not have transitional skills to other jobs and might not be able to find another job in the near vicinity. Do note this does not include the highly specialized. If there are a limited number of people with the skills required to handle the job, likely the employer will know that and will bend over backwards to keep said person or people happy, as they would be really hard to replace. If you like this video and would like to see more, please comment, like, subscribe, and/or share. If you don't like this video, please leave me a comment so I could do better next time. Links to Facebook, Twitter, Minds, and Patreon are in the description.